You're watching a Highwire Media podcast.
Welcome to the Cinema Gold Show. And this week we continue our Central City rewatch with The Flash, Season 1, Episode 6, titled The Flash is Born. Before we dive right into this episode, let me know your thoughts on the season this far, and specifically this episode. And with that, let's dive right in, shall we? The Flash is a television series that combines superhero spectacle, character drama, and mystery. In Season 1, Episode 6, titled The Flash is Born, the show begins to more deeply weave Barry Allen's personal history with his present battles, introducing a villain whose origins and conflicts echo Barry's own past. This episode also marks a symbolic turning point. Iris West, through her blog, coins the name The Flash, giving Barry a lasting superhero identity. Tonight, we're going to take a close look at the episode, analyzing its narrative structure, character dynamics, thematic resonances, and its role in the broader arc of the season. I argue that Episode 6 is, for the first time, more than a villain of the week outing. It integrates Barry's internal struggle with his external conflict, pushing forward both his hero journey and the mystery surrounding his mother's murder. The episode underscores themes of identity, trauma, and the hazards of power. While not without flaws, notably in its treatment of Iris West, it solidifies several narrative strands that will become pivotal in the series unfolding. In The Flash is Born, a new metahuman emerges in Central City, Tony Woodward, alias Girder, who can turn his body into metallic steel. Barry Allen, operating as the Streak, or the Flash now, encounters Tony in the act of stealing a Hummer. He attempts to intervene, but his punches bounce off Tony's armored skin, and he is soundly defeated, emerging bruised and grievously hurt, with 13 fractures. The following day, Barry reports to Joe West and the CCPD that his adversary is a metahuman. In a briefing, they identify him as Tony Woodward. Barry experiences a flashback as a child. Tony bullied him following his father's arrest, taunting him with the phrase, "Looks like you were born to take a beating." At Star Labs, the team, Wells, Cisco, and Caitlin, attempt to devise a strategy to take down Girder. Cisco built a steel dummy for Barry to train against, but Barry's trauma and lingering insecurity hampers his efforts. Meanwhile, Iris West continues her blog about the Streak, which draws Tony's attention. Tony confronts Iris at her workplace and demands information. He crushes her phone to prevent her from contacting the police. As Barry pursues Tony, he is again beaten and attacked. Cisco calculates the required speed for Barry to land a punch that would pierce Tony's steel form. In a dramatic escalation, Tony kidnaps Iris and takes her to the elementary school the two once attended. He demands she publish a blog post claiming the Streak is dead, naming Tony as a new man on campus. Iris triggers the alarm to summon law enforcement. Barry races to the scene, building up to Mach 1.1 from a 5.3 mile distance so his punch can break Tony's steel shell. The plan succeeds. Barry bottoms Tony, Iris throws a punch, and Tony falls unconscious. At the episode's end, Barry reveals his identity to Tony in the Star Labs prison. Barry and Iris reconcile at Jitters, and Iris renames the Streak to The Flash, adopting Barry's preferred name. Elsewhere, Joe confronts Wells about Nora Allen's murder. Later, a red blur enters Joe's home, removes evidence, and leaves behind a photo of Iris with a knife stabbed through it. Unlike earlier episodes that emphasize external action more heavily than internal stakes, The Flash is Born strikes a more balanced structure. The main plot, Barry vs. Girder, is interwoven with two key subplots: Iris's evolving public presence and Joe's growing suspicion about Wells. The episode maintains a three-act structure: introduction of the threat and failure, strategic recalibration, and climatic confrontation. Act 1 introduces Tony's crime and Barry's defeat, establishing the stakes and forcing Barry and the team to confront the limits of his power. Act 2 centers on planning and conflict escalation. Iris's blog draws Tony's wrath. Barry trains, Tony kidnaps, and the threat rises. Act 3 is the rescue and the triumph of strategy and speed. Barry executes the punch, rescues Iris, and settles the villain in captivity. but also sets in motion the larger mysteries concerning Wells and the Reverse Flash. The pacing is fairly brisk. The writers are careful not to linger unduly on action sequences alone. Emotional beats, Barry's childhood trauma, Iris's fear, and Joe's distrust punctuate the flow. That said, some critics have argued that portions dealing with Iris feel like filler, and that her character remains underutilized in the narrative. One structural strength lies in the synergy between the micro and macro. The villain's origin resonates with Barry's own pain, making the confrontation more than mere spectacle. This episode pushes Barry further beyond mere reaction. Up to this point, Barry has primarily responded to threats, sometimes doubting his abilities. In episode 6, however, he reaches a turning point. He must integrate both physical and emotional strength. His childhood flashbacks expose his sense of inferiority and vulnerability. Facing Tony, an embodiment of past trauma, forces Barry to grapple with his own identity, not just as a speedster, but as someone who deserves respect and agency. Barry's decision to run 5.3 miles and strike at Mach 1.1 represents a strategic choice rather than brute force. It reflects growth. He's not merely faster, but smarter. Moreover, by revealing himself to Tony after his defeat, Barry makes a statement about using power responsibly and differentiating himself from other metahumans. In doing so, he claims moral authority. The physical wounds he suffers throughout the episode symbolize the cost of heroism and the sacrifices inherent in the role. Though Tony is arguably one of the more one-dimensional antagonists in the series, he functions effectively here as a foil to Barry. Tony's aggression, his resentment over his own downfall, and his bullying of Barry resonate with a familiar pattern of how trauma and resentment breed violence. His transformation into Girder, the solid steel form, mirrors how emotional wounds can harden into armor. Tony's motivations are not deeply explored, but his personal history gives him enough plausibility. Still, as critics have pointed out, his dialogue and depth are limited. He's more of a symbolic villain than a fully fleshed antagonist. Nevertheless, because his conflict intersects with Barry's past, he becomes a meaningful tester of Barry's capability to transform hurt into purpose. Iris is a conflicted character in this episode. Her blog gives her narrative agency. She's not simply a damsel, but an active participant in the mythos of the streak. Her voiceover echoes Barry's pilot narration, signaling her shifting role in the story. However, the episode also reverts her to a more passive role. She's kidnapped, threatened, and used as bait. Critics have argued that the show undercuts Iris's potential by making her too often the plot device rather than a drive of agency. Her confrontation with Tony is superficial. Though she attempts to resist, ultimately Barry must rescue her. Yet her blog post, the renaming to the Flash, serves as a pivotal symbolic moment. That she delivers the name finalizes her transformation from observer to participant in Barry's world. The dynamic between Joe West and Wells intensifies in this episode. Joe's suspicions about Nora Allen's murder deepen. He confronts Wells about inconsistencies in his story and points out that Wells moved to Central City shortly after the murder. Wells deflects, pointing Joe towards Tess Morgan, a former research partner. Joe's frustration with Wells begins to crystallize into mistrust, sowing the seeds of a long-term tension. Wells is more reserved, masking his knowledge and motivations. His "interesting, a Man of Steel" remark, upon hearing of Tony, reads as a wink to the audience, revealing that Wells knows more than he lets on. This dual role, mentor and enigma, makes Wells a compelling presence in the episode. His hidden agendas and guarded demeanor hint at deeper stakes ahead. Eddie Thawne also gets a bit more depth. In his conversations with Barry, Eddie reveals his own past of being bullied and his attempt to channel frustration into strength. While not deeply explored, this parallels Barry's trajectory, offering a mirror. One of the central themes of the episode is naming and identity. Barry rejects the streak and also objects to being called a streak by the public. He wants a name more aspirational. Iris, through her blog, names him the Flash, which Barry ultimately accepts. The renaming marks a shift from ambiguous vigilante to defined hero. Tony's identity as Girder is literally a new form imposed on him, overlaying his old self with steel. That Barry facing Tony must find a way to pierce that shell, physically and psychologically, underscores that identity is not fixed, and that change requires both force and insight. Barry's childhood trauma, being called the son of a murderer, being physically abused by Tony, lingers throughout the episode. Tony embodies the morphing of that trauma into aggression. The conflict between Barry and Tony represents the tension between reacting to trauma with violence versus transforming it with purpose. Barry's success lies not in defeating Tony by brute force, but by skill, strategy, and emotional resolve. The episode also raises the question, how do we respond to adversity when we become powerful? Barry must decide how to wield his speed without becoming detached, tyrannical, or vengeful. His restraint in revealing himself to Tony, lecturing him rather than humiliating him, reflects the conscious use of power. Iris's blog involvement underscores the risk of exposure. By publicizing the streak, she makes herself a target. Tony's destruction of her phone and kidnapping threaten to erase her agency. The episode uncomfortably balances her narrative significance with her vulnerability. Her voiceover framing introduces and concludes the episode, but she remains peripheral in action. Critics argue that this balance is uneasy. The show relies on her symbolic role, but undercuts it by making her passive. The episode deepens the underlying mystery of Nora Allen's murder in the Reverse Flash. Joe's growing mistrust of Wells, the post-credits removal of evidence, and the knife through Iris's photo all hint at unseen forces maneuvering in the background. The narrative suggests that even as Barry fights routine villains, the real threat lies hidden. Trust, secrets, and revelations are thus foundational to the season's larger stakes. So now we're going to take a look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of this episode. So, starting with strengths, we have right off the bat, we got intricated stakes. By tying the villain's origins to Barry's past, the episode elevates the confrontation from spectacle to emotional resonance. And then we have, of course, heroic growth. Barry's evolution, learning that force alone is insufficient and that strategy, speed, and compassion matter, and is more evident here than in previous episodes. This episode has momentum for the overarching plot. The subplot about Joe, Wells, and the Reverse Flash continue to gather steam, and the episode's post-credits twist neatly connects the Monster of the Week to the broader mythology. And then, audience engagement and world building. Iris's renaming of Barry gives fans a new terminology anchor, the Flash. Also, the fact that Barry must perform at Mach 1.1 draws attention to the science of the show, grounding the action in a pseudo-scientific framework. And of course, while there might be strengths to some shows, there's also weaknesses. So, to begin, we have an underdeveloped villain. Tony Girder succeeds in functioning but lacks depth. He's more archetype than person, limiting the emotional stakes. Iris's inconsistent agency. Although she is vital to the naming moment, much of her role is reactive and peripheral. She is threatened and rescued rather than acting decisively. And of course, we have repetition of the hero doubts formula. Barry's struggles with confidence echo previous episodes. While well handled here, it veers towards formulaic. The show risks predictability if it doesn't deepen these arcs. Some viewers note that the Mach 1.1 uppercut premise strains plausibility. The sonic boom timing is inconsistent. The sound arrives before the punch. And still, as a narrative device, it works to raise the stakes, enforcing Barry's unique solution. Episode 6 occupies a transitional role in Season 1. It brings together disparate threads. The naming of Barry as the Flash provides a symbolic turning point for his heroic identity. The confrontation with Tony allows Barry to test his limits and set a standard for how he will use his speed. The Joe Wells friction escalates suspicion and positions Wells more clearly within the mystery. The post-credits twist connects the local threat to the unseen menace of the Reverse Flash, reminding the audience that the big bad is still looming. Thus, episode 6 helps move the season's narrative forward while still serving as a self-contained villain plot. Though more restrained than later episodes in visual flair, The Flash is Born showcases effective use of cinematic techniques, including flashbacks and cross-cutting. The insertion of Barry's childhood scenes with Tony bullying him offers emotional depth and contextualizes current conflict. The intercutting between past and present underscores the thematic echo. And then you got slow reveals. The script withholds full exposition of Tony's origins until mid-episode, letting the audience piece together clues, including, stolen kegs from steelworks. And then you also have sound design and pacing in the final run. The sequence in which Barry accelerates through the city is heightened by escalating sound and visual distortion, emphasizing speed and risk. The build-up to the Mach 1.1 punch is framed as a thing of precision, not brute force. The use of color and framing, of course. The use of metal textures, steel grays, and harsh lighting in Tony's spaces reinforces his cold, hardened persona. Scenes with Barry emphasize motion, light trails, and contrast. And then we have parallelism and mirroring. Barry's training against the steel dummy, his repeated defeats, his final triumph. These motifs mirror his eternal struggle. Iris's voiceover, echoing Barry's narration in the plot, links their narrative trajectories. These stylistic choices are modest but effective. They reinforce the thematic weight without overpowering the character drama. From a viewer's perspective, The Flash is Born can be viewed as a test of Barry's moral and psychological fitness for heroism. The core conflict is not merely defeating Tony, but deciding how to do it. By brute force or by mindful strategy. Barry's victory is harder earned because it depends on knowledge, trust in his team, and emotional resolve. The episode also highlights the danger inherent in naming, myth-making, and public identity. Once Barry is named the Flash, he ceases to be just a mystery. He becomes a symbol. That symbolic status grants more weight to his choices and more targets to protect, not just himself, but Iris, Joe, and the public. Yet the episode's treatment of Iris remains problematic. While the show gives her a narrative voice, it fails to grant her narrative agency commensurate with that voice. Repeatedly, she becomes a victim rather than an instigator. Iris seems misjudged, portrayed as smart, but too often treated as uninformed or protected. For the series to fully deliver balanced character arcs, it must develop Iris more as a proactive participant. The reliance on repeated hero doubts cycles also pose a risk. If Barry's confidence scenes become too routine, they may lose emotional impact. The show must evolve its struggles into deeper questions rather than replaying the same beats. Finally, the tension between science and fantasy in the show is on display here. The Mach 1.1 punch is compelling, but scientifically shaky. The show leans on pseudoscience to elevate stakes. Viewers willing to suspend disbelief will accept it. Those more critical may note inconsistency. But as a narrative tool, it works. Barry's victory is not about brute speed, but calculated velocity. Episode 6 of The Flash is Born, is a crucial hinge point. It transforms Barry's ambiguous vigilante identity into a named hero, forces him to wrestle with personal trauma, and it advances the underlying mystery of his mother's murder and the lurking threat of Reverse Flash. Though not perfect, especially in its treatment of Iris and the somewhat thin villain, this episode demonstrates the show's evolving confidence in blending character, mythology, and action. By aligning Barry's external struggle against Girder with his internal reckoning, the episode deepens the narrative stakes. It calibrates That balance the show will continue to refine between episodic villainy and serialized mythos, between spectacle and character, between speed and soul. If I were to suggest a direction forward, I would urge stronger agency for Iris, more complex villains tied to the central mythology, and ever greater subversion of the hero doubts formula. But as it stands, episode 6 is, in the context of the first season, a turning point. The moment the streak becomes the Flash and Barry begins to truly own his destiny. With that being said, let me know your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. What were your thoughts of episode 6? And what do you think of season 1 so far? And of course, give us a thumbs up if you like our video. Hit that subscribe button down below. Hit the bell notification button to be notified of future videos. And of course, if you want to support the channel, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/cinemagold. It's buymeacoffee.com/cinemagold. And no matter what you give, whether it's $1, $5, $50, $100, anything you give is greatly appreciated. And it goes right back into this channel. With your support, we'll upgrade our equipment, bring in new hosts, be able to pay them, and eventually take this show on the road. As always, support is very much appreciated. And with that, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.